This is an interview with Golda Krolik, a prominent leader in the metropolitan Detroit community. In connection with the 75th anniversary of the United Jewish Charities and the 50th anniversary of the Jewish Welfare Federation, these organizations have undertaken to record the memories and experiences of a number of community leaders, which highlight developments in the organized Jewish community. This interview with Mrs. Krolik is being taped in her home on January 10th, 1975. The interviewer is Mary Baroff. Okay. Before we get into the area of your own and your family's experiences and involvements with the Jewish community activities, could you tell me something about yourself and your background?
Well, I suppose we should begin with where I was born, which was on Adelaide Street, near John R., a thoroughly integrated neighborhood religiously. A Catholic church was at the corner. 2 or 3 of really important Catholic families were our close neighbors. Half a dozen well-known Jewish families were across the street from us, and at the far end of the block there was even a Jewish actress. We were brought up as children, the little children on the block, by a lovely Catholic woman, Mary O'Grady, who lived in a 2-family house, an unusual arrangement in those days, later occupied by a Jewish family by the name of Stocker. The Stockers were Orthodox Jews, and they and Miss O'Grady became fast friends. I think this was typical of the whole neighborhood. Across the street from us lived the Hirschman family, who had come from northern Michigan. Dr. Hirschman had died and left a family of 3 or 4 sons, I'd have to count, and 2 daughters, one of whom died just last year at the age of 93, I think, and some of whose family are still living. I think it never occurred to any of us that we were any different from anyone else. We knew perfectly well we were Jewish children. We knew there were Catholic children because the cook, and everybody had a cook, always went to Mass the first thing in the morning, and once or twice took one of us. What they believed or what we believed never was a matter of any importance. About 5 or 6 blocks over, across Brush Street toward Beaubien and Antwine, a few Negro families lived, and the first little girl that I ever brought home from school was a black girl by the name of Prudence Beasley. I have never seen her since that 2nd or 3rd grade. We both went to the Roberts School. But I have a feeling that Prudence probably played a part in my life that indicated some of the things I'd do later. I took it for granted. Prudence was my friend. I also had a 3rd grade teacher who was a black teacher, one of the very few in this whole Detroit school system, whom we adored. We had hated our 2nd grade teacher. And we adored Miss Grattan, and I think, again, Miss Grattan had an effect on me, of which I was not aware, and I was lucky enough once to get an award and pay a tribute to Miss Grattan, much to the amazement of my family, who'd never heard me speak of her before. Father was obviously interested in poor people. There were 2 chairs in the front hall of our house, most uncomfortable, handsomely carved chairs, and we children called them the chairs for Father's men. Father came home for lunch, not lunch. It didn't become lunch right away. At first, as a matter of fact, in my day, always at my time, in my daytime, my lifetime, we spoke of lunch and we had dinner at night. I think this was not common. Most people had dinner at noon and supper at night. There would always be 2 men waiting for Father to come home, and they had been sent by the Charities, who apparently were in the neighborhood. And where they were at that time, I really don't know.
What did your father do?
Father was a scrap metal dealer to begin with, down on the corner of Dubois and Franklin, and very close to the Franklin Street settlement, which again, the fact of the Franklin Street settlements being there, and of our knowing about it, I think had some influence on my life. Father drove a horse and buggy every day and came home for lunch until the great moment came when automobiles hit Detroit. The first car I ever saw was driven by Louis Hirschman, who later was the leading rectal surgeon in Detroit, who had a small Ford runabout, which he drove, I suppose, in 1906 or something of the sort. We had an early car, very early, which Father refused to drive. And I suppose someone drove it until I was maybe 14 or 15, when I did all the driving. Nobody had a license. There were no rules or regulations. I haven't the faintest idea when any of those things happened.
I don't think we discussed. What year were you born?
I was born in 1892. My mother died in March when I was 8 years old. I had an older brother who had been born almost blind, and a younger sister, 20 months younger than I. My brother, as is the way in Jewish families, was a terribly important person in the family. He was the eldest son, and the fact of his blindness made it important that he have special treatment. He had a governess for a while who taught him Braille, taught him to work with a stylus, taught him to use a Braille machine, and taught him also to be completely independent. He could see enough to go anywhere he wanted to alone. He played with all of us, and he walked to school. But because of his handicap, Father felt he ought to go to a private school. Father believed strongly in public schools. So he went way over to Elmwood and Jefferson, where the DUS, the Detroit University School, stood, and he and a close friend walked that distance every single day. And nobody thought anything of it.
What schools were you educated in?
I went first to the Alfred School, which went only to the 3rd grade. Then we were moved down to the Washington Normal School, which is where Hudson's Warehouse is now. And while I was there, they tried an experiment, which they've never repeated. They decided that there was no need for us for good students to go through 8 grades. And in the middle of the 7th grade, or the middle of the 8th, at the beginning of the 8th grade, we were moved up bodily, our whole class, with our teacher, to Central High School.
Which is the old
Is
Wayne
now-
University, which is now Wayne
is-
University.
Yes, and it's Wayne University's main building.
Mhm.
I don't know how that experience worked. I know I never knew anybody else having it. After my mother's death, Father brought to live with us her 2 younger sisters. One was 13 years older than I. One, I suppose, was 15 or 16. One of the younger one went to the University of Michigan. The older one graduated from what was then known as Teachers College and started to teach at the Bishop School, which was in a black neighborhood, and had no Jewish children at all. She prepared, and I remember helping her, make for those children every single Christmas stockings, and taught them, as she was expected to do, Christmas carols. At my mother's death, she gave up her job and came home to keep house. And my younger aunt continued at the University of Michigan until graduation.
And you also went to the University of Michigan.
Father believed in coeducation and in public schools. We very much wanted to go to Vassar, my sister and I. And Father said no. All our friends were going to Vassar. Father said no, and I'm sure he was right. I graduated with a pigtail down my back from Central High School, having adored every single minute of being in school. My 3 best friends were not Jewish girls. One was from Grosse Pointe, and why she came to Central, I'll never know. Marjorie Metcalf, an old Detroit family. One was a very poor girl by the name of Mary Rogers, and another was a Polish girl by the name of Della Brichta, whom I met many, many years later. We were 3 excellent students, and we did all our work together, and had no social life so far as the boys were concerned at all. The year I adored every bit of school except my German. I hated German from the very first semester. I didn't like the teacher, didn't like Germans, didn't like anything about them. And this is based on a perfectly silly reason that we won't go into now. While we were at school, in those days, it was just after some of the big waves of education, we were asked as a standard question when you entered high school, what nationality your grandparents were. And we were told we were Russian. I thought being Russian was very romantic. I had read Thaddeus of Warsaw or something else. I read all the time. And Russian it was on the papers. When I have said to friends since that we were Russian, they've said, but Golda, nobody is Russian. You're Ukrainian or Hungarian or something else, or Polish, but you're not. I said, well, that's literally all I know, and I have never known where my grandparents were born.
Were they born? Did they immigrate here?
My Helfman grandparents, my father's parents, immigrated here during the Civil War, or before the Civil War. There's a legend in the family that father was born in Columbus, Indiana. How they ever got to Columbus, Indiana, I'll never know. haven't the faintest idea. But there's a legend in the family that at the age of 16, my grandfather stood on a bridge with a musket on his shoulder to hold off the Johnny Rebs who never got that far north. My mother's family came over, and my mother was born in Syracuse, New York, where there was a Reform congregation. Long before being Reformed was at all popular. And she was brought up as a Reformed Jew. She was in the third class to graduate from the University of Syracuse, and was a charter member of the Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority. She walked 3 miles to school and back, and much of this is in a book that the Syracuse community has gotten out from from a minion to a community. I think Dr. Edgar knows the book. And
What was your mother, what did your mother major in?
Major?
There was no such thing as a major.
At the University of Michigan we had no majors.
Is that right?
We had absolutely free choice. You could take anything you wanted. And my mother did teach school. Couldn't have taught for very long. She and my father met at the home of people who were related to each of them, but they were not related to each other. Mrs. Zenner, whose daughter later married a Krolik, was the person at whose home they met.
Was this in Syracuse or in Detroit?
In Syracuse.
In Syracuse.
And Mrs. Zenner then came to Detroit to live with her family, and was the first person to take me when I was born, to hold me. My mother had a woman doctor, Dr. Warner. Dr. Warner and Mrs. Bishop, her sister, had graduated in the first class from Vassar. I think that was pretty advanced for my mother. My mother was a little woman, tiny, quite tiny, and very pretty apparently. I have her wedding dress, and none of my little grandchildren can get into it. I'll show you a picture. And taught for maybe a year or two, not very long, and came to Detroit. My father was a Reformed Jew, was a member of whatever temple there was. That was Temple Beth. But his parents were founders of Congregation Charities. And we lived next door to them, and each went his own way religiously. Father was a member of the 2 congregations.
When did your father come to the Detroit community?
I don't know, but he couldn't. His elder brother graduated from the University of Michigan Law School, so they must have come up when Father was in his teens. Oh yes, of course he was in high school. He went to the old Biddle House, which is where the Pontchartrain, which is now the National Bank building, went to high school in the Biddle House.
Oh, there was a school there?
Yes. I wonder if Frank Angelo has that in his book. I'd have to look that up. And then did not go to college for some reason. And never forgave himself, and did everything he could later to make up for it. Studied vigorously.
Did he come separate from his family, or did his
No, the whole family.
The whole family moved here?
His parents lived on Columbian Brush, and Father's first year of his married life was in that home. And I think it was the reason that he brought us up firmly, never to live with your parents. And he made it very clear that we never would live with him, that he would never live with any of us. Now, none of this has anything to do with what you really want.
Yes, it does.
It really does.
Yeah, Mrs. Krolik, you went to the University of Michigan. I know that you were the first woman editor.
Oh, well, that was much later.
Yes, that was much later.
Yes, when I went, there were, I think, 8 Jewish girls to begin with on the campus. And my brother was a senior there. And it was when one of my aunts died that I came home to run the household, and my sister continued. Oh, and in the middle of all this, we had what was known as in the family as the flood. Now let's backtrack, because the one thing you want to know about is the day nursery. After my mother's death, the Hannah Schloss Building must have then have been standing. And Father furnished and maintained a day nursery for babies and little children of those immigrant women who were trying to earn a living. Well, it was found that they couldn't. There were no needle trades here in Detroit, which is what the Jewish women did in New York. And I think it didn't last too long. We, as little girls, went over and played with the children when we were, 10, 11 years old. We were not allowed to feed them. We were not allowed to pick up the babies, but we played with them.
So that you were actually a volunteer at the age of 10.
I was. There was no question about that. And then when I was about 14, they asked me to register children for camp. And I can remember one little boy said to me, told me his name, and I said, "What?" And he repeated it, and I said, "Calvin?" And he said, "Yes." And I wrote that this nice Orthodox Jewish boy's first name was Calvin. What it really was, I'll never know. I also remember that there was some talk about where they were to go to camp. And I said to somebody, upstart that I was, "Did you ever ask the people who go to camp what kind of a camp they'd like?" And they said, "Well, we know what's best." And I remember that.
So you had some very early social work concepts.
Well, I was brought up in the middle of social work. There was no getting away from it. Father was president of the Charities at one time.
How did he first become involved? Were his family also community involved?
His mother, I think, was a founder of the Hostess shelter. Now, if she wasn't a founder, she was on the early board. It was one of her pets. And his parents, both parents, his father probably, I think, was one of the founders of Congregation Charities. But what other, and I think they had something, no, Father was involved with the Hebrew Free Loan. Well,
so Mrs. Krolik, actually, you come by your activities with the community quite naturally because of your family's deep involvement, and you really started at a very early age with your going in to take care of the little children.
Not take care, play with.
Play with.
It was very carefully outlined to us that we were not taking care, that we were children, and as a volunteer you did as you were told and not as you wanted to. And I think that's important.
Right. Who were these children that
They were the
you
children
served?
of immigrant families whose mothers presumably were learning trades, who had just come to America, and whose mothers had gone to work. Well, their going to work didn't work mostly. It was about this same time also that Mrs. Sarah Krolik started what was known as a self-help circle to teach these women sewing and to teach them cooking and the kind of thing that an American housewife had to know. And I was in a class that she taught, because she had to teach teachers. All the girls in high school were supposed to help out, and I never passed the sewing class, which was very sad. I think Miss Edith Hemrich, who is still living, has her workbook. And it's possible that if Barbara asks her for it, that she might photograph it or something, because Barbara knows Edith very well. And Edith is 93 and very deaf. Then I had the job, the volunteer job of getting the penny lunch people. And that's part of the history, really, of the Jewish Women's Club, which later became the Council of Jewish Women. And then...
What did they do?
What?
The penny...
The penny lunch was the kids paid a penny if they could, and they had a hot lunch. It was they were poor children who couldn't afford a decent meal. It's exactly the same as they're doing today. A hot lunch in the schools for children who can't afford it.
Was this at the Hannah Schloss Building?
No, this was in the schools.
I see.
And it was given by the Jewish Women's Club, and financed and staffed by volunteers. And how long that lasted, I think at that time my aunt Della, was president of the club, and maybe that's why I got roped in.
And you were in high school at that time?
I had just graduated and had nothing, presumably, to do because I was too young to go to college.
And then when you went on to college, were you involved in any activities at that time?
Oh, well, at college, yes, right away you got involved in things. I was on the league. We had what was known as the Women's League board, and I was, amazingly enough, I was treasurer of the basketball team, which was a very strange place to find myself. And I was in things, and I can't tell you offhand what they were. I know I made one honor society after another, then was told I wasn't really eligible because I had come and gone so that I didn't have the right number of credits for various things. I was in the first class that went into Martha Cook, the dormitory at Michigan. And there, because I was a little older than many of the girls, I was asked to use my influence to keep the freshmen from smoking. And I remember telling the house mother that if I tried to use my influence, I would have none. And what was more, I couldn't see anything wrong in the freshmen smoking. Which has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
But it has a lot to do with Mrs. Krolik.
I don't remember having anything except a very good time at college, though everybody did extracurricular somethings.
Then you came back to Detroit.
Then I was in and out of Detroit 2 different times. Then I was in this elevator accident when I broke my leg and injured my spine. And then I went back to college after my sister graduated, and she stayed home and kept the house. Mm-hmm. And went to work for the Associated Charities, which was Harry Lurie, who is a well-known name in social work circles, was running the Associated Charities then. And she did, I suppose, what we call casework. And whom the Associated Charities catered to, I don't know. There was nothing else in those days but the Poor Commission.
What did you do?
I had gone back to college in the meantime. And at college is where they put an ad in the paper that they were going to put a woman on the staff of the Daily. There'd never been a woman inside the Daily building. They always had a girl, Martha Jones, I think was her name, who wrote the notices. The girls' glee club will meet, the girls' basketball team will meet, and so forth. And the messenger picked it up at the Pi-Fi house and took it to the Daily office and brought it back. She never put foot inside the office. Well, the editor decided he was going to put a girl on the staff. There was a notice in the Daily. I went over and applied. Nobody else showed up, and I got the job.
What did you do for the Daily?
And the next day, the dean called me. And she said, Golda, I understand that Mr. McKinney plans to have you working in the Daily office. And I said, yes. And she said, well, I'm going to allow you to do this because I know that I can always trust you to be a lady. And those are my credentials as a journalist. And it never occurred to her that part of being a reporter was interviewing someone, as I interviewed Fritz Kreisler, for example, after a concert. And I crossed the campus in Ann Arbor at midnight alone. That never entered her head. And I had an extremely good time on the Daily, very good. And I recruited quite a few cubs who later became really good newspaper women here in Detroit. Vera Brown was one of the big ones. And Margaret Mile and, the girl on the news, on the society editor of the Times was... Anyhow, the next year the war broke out. And the whole staff turned female. The men all went. And from then on, there was no big thing. But that was the best job I ever had.
And then you worked for Mrs. Lurie?
No, my sister worked, Mr. Lurie.
Oh, I see.
Here in Detroit.
I see. Uh-huh.
And then she got married.
Uh-huh.
Then I wanted to be a nurse because somebody in our family, I felt, ought to go to the war. My sister was married to a man who was not well, and she couldn't go. My brother was almost blind, and he couldn't go. So I thought it was up to me to go. And I applied to Harper and Mount Sinai in New York, and some other, Massachusetts General.
For training.
For training, and they all wrote back that they would take me in 3 years. They were overcrowded. And so then I went to work. I got a job immediately with the American Red Cross Home Service, and that was a professional social work job without any training of any kind at all.
And what did you do?
I was a caseworker, and then I was a supervisor. And we worked with the families of men who had gone and who weren't getting any money. Most of their allotments were held up. And you took streetcars all over town. The height of my ambition was to go to the end of the Myrtle Line. And I've never been to the end of the Myrtle Line yet. I worked from the river to the boulevard. And on both sides of Woodward, I remember I worked on Gata Street down in there. And there I worked with families of all classes and kinds and everything. And we had to report to the case committee that met every week as to whether a family was to get a given amount of money and so forth and so forth. And at that time I resolved that if ever I were on a case committee, I would take the social worker's word because she knew what it was about. And of course, when I got to be on the case committees, I began wondering if the workers were really quite that smart after all. And I worked there until the war was over. And then I went to Harry Laurie, who was head of the Associated Charities, and I said to him, now I need some more training if I'm going to be a social worker. Where can I get the best training? And he said, well, the smartest social worker in Detroit is Eleanor Hutzel at Women's Hospital. See if she'll take you on. I went to see her, and she said, I can put you in working with unmarried mothers, and I'll be glad to have you because we're short, and you'll work out of Women's Hospital and have your meal here as part of your pay.
What year was this?
This was right after the war. Must have been 1918.
1918.
And there again we had a case committee who recommended various things about the girls. And I discovered then that almost anybody could have an illegitimate baby. And there was no such thing in those days as legal abortion. Literally no such thing. And if a girl attempted something herself, she was usually desperately ill. And I stayed on that job a year, I think. We skipped a big point in there, in between that.
Go back.
Yes, somewhere in there. I was working at the North End Clinic when it moved. When the Hannah Schloss building opened, I guess, after the war, right after the war, they opened a clinic, a neighborhood clinic, unaffiliated with any hospital, which was an unheard of thing in those days. And volunteers were needed to take the doctor's notes as he interviewed the patients. And the first doctor I was assigned to was Harry Solstein. Tall, handsome, Yale graduate, Johns Hopkins graduate, new man in town if ever anybody was. And every girl in the city was a flutter. And he handed me words like metatarsal. And I hadn't any more idea than the man in the moon how to spell them, and metabolism. That was a very strenuous job. And then they decided that they had outgrown the space down there, and they were going to move the clinic up to a building which had been given by the Weinemans on Holbrook, the North End Clinic.
The old clinic.
And they moved it up there, and presumably the managing person up there was a woman by the name of something Goldstein. Louisa Goldstein. And Fred Butzel came in one day and said to me, Golda, I want you to run this clinic. And I said, I was a volunteer. I said, does Miss Goldstein know it? And he said, yes, and it's going to be unpleasant. But she has not proved entirely satisfactory. And I want you to be at the admitting desk. And it's understood. So I did. And Harry Solstein was chief of staff, and Dr. Amberg, whom you may have heard of, was one of the leading people there. Dr. Rosenzweig, who is still around, Dr. Seeger, Dr. Sandweiss, Dr. Myers, all those men were the founders of North End Clinic.
In the early period.
And I came down in the middle of all that with some kind of colitis and had to stop, and when I stopped, I said this should not be a volunteer job. A professional medical social worker ought to take over. And they hired an excellent person whose name I can't remember, who was a humpback girl. And anybody in the Charities knows who that was. And she ran it for a long time, and then Stella Sempliner ran it.
So that your interest in the nursing and medical profession goes...
And not medical, in nursing. It's interesting because I've stuck to nursing till this minute. I'm right in the middle of, have been, the most satisfactory thing I ever did is a nursing committee I'm on now, where it really worked. I'll tell you about that some other time.
So we backtracked.
And wait a moment, I want to tell you about the North End Clinic. The doctors were all trying to get a Jewish hospital. A lot, because Jewish doctors were not welcome on the staffs of the big hospitals. Harper very condescendingly took one or two, and many of them wouldn't take any. And there were all kinds of efforts to establish a Jewish hospital, about which a good many other people can tell you more than I. I only know that Julian, who was not then my husband, was president of the North End Clinic for 7 years. And Jess Hirschman, who was the architect for it, was one of the strong board members. Blanche Mendelsohn, who died very recently, was on that board. When they finally did build a Jewish hospital, they completely,
This is a second interview with Golda Krolik. It is being taped at her home on January 21st, 1975. I'd like now to get into the area of your own involvements with the community, particularly your relationships with the Jewish community. We've talked about a number of your involvements already, and if you don't mind, I'd like to start with what your involvements have been with the Jewish Welfare Federation.
I suppose they began, as I told you last time, when I worked at the clinic at the Hannah Schloss Building and took notes for Harry Saulstein. From there, we were all promoted to the North End Clinic, where theoretically I was the admitting officer. It was not a simple arrangement because the young woman who had done it before, somewhat to the discomfort of one or two of the doctors, a number of the doctors, was not welcoming any extra assistance. However, they asked me to do it, and it obviously needed to be done, and I did do it. And at that point, as I think I did tell you, any girl in Detroit would have done anything for Harry Saulstein. He was tall and handsome, and he went to Yale. Detroit boys went to Harvard. And he graduated from Johns Hopkins, and he was a brilliant young new man in town.
Mm-hmm. How did you get into the Federation?
As a volunteer in the beginning, I suppose I had time on my hands at that moment. I was in and out of college all the time. It must have been one of the years that I was home from college and running the household. And I put in mornings down there. I kept house with my father for a long time, and it didn't take all my time by any means.
And then when you went to work at the Jewish Welfare Federation.
Then when I went to work for the Jewish Welfare Federation, it was after my husband's death. I went first to the community's chest. Oh, backtrack a minute. I called up the chairman of the Social Workers Association or whatever it was, and said, my husband died last week and I have to go to work. It was the depths of the Depression, and I had 3 small children. And the only thing I know, the only experience I have had was with American Red Cross Home Service and the Women's Hospital. and I've done some freelance writing. And where would you suggest I apply? And he said, well, how many degrees have you? And I said, I have nothing. And he said, you haven't an A.B.? I said, no, I never graduated. I came home and kept house. He said, well, in that case, you'll have to take a non-professional job. They're cutting staff at the community chest because they have no money. And they have let go all their best people. They may take you on. You're not too experienced, and you'll probably work for less. Go and see Mr. Dodge. I went to see the community chest people. They were delighted to take me on for 3 months on one job, and then they were pleased enough with what I was doing that they asked me to stay on and be publicity director for the campaign. Kurt Pizer, who was the director of the Jewish Welfare Federation and felt that the Jewish Welfare Federation handled almost anything better than the community chest did, suggested to Mr. Dodge that when we were through with our campaign, I should come and work on the spring campaign with the Jewish Welfare Federation. I was very glad to keep on working. And I did. I think I was getting at this time the princely sum of about $15 a week.
What responsibilities did you have at the Federation?
I was publicity director. I had to write and rewrite people's speeches. I had to get all our news into the Jewish news, which made it much simpler than working for the community chest. I had to interview the agencies and get up stories about them. And I had to see that corrected lists of giving were announced. We kept our lists of giving out of the daily papers, which made it much easier. The daily papers used to publish a list of the community chest workers, gifts either from under 1,000 or under 500 every single day, and that was a terrific job. The Federation was much simpler. Esther Prussian was in charge of the office. A very competent, very, very competent person who had a very strict sense of what was proper. And she was Miss Prussian to her very best friends, and I was Mrs. Krolik. No, I was Mrs. Mayer. And there was no getting around that. Her assistant, Helen Aronson, saved my life. She told me the ins and outs of who and what in the committee, on various committees. George Stutz and, Henry the Hatter, you know, that darling, George's sidekick. There were two of them that worked together all the time in the commission, in the Federation. George can tell you in a minute, and his name will come to me. Were always overwhelmingly kind to me, as was the one Jew on the Detroit News, who Adler was his name. Philip Adler. Later married a good friend of mine. And he was very kind when I went to cover a meeting. He realized I was not terribly experienced, and he would tell me what I should be doing. Mr. Pizer suggested to Mr. Dodge that he keep me. Mr. Dodge discussed the problem with me, and I told him I would work for one organization or the other, but that he needed a full-time volunteer. He needed a full-time director. I didn't know whether Mr. Pizer really did, but there was no question that all year round there ought to be something in the paper, month after month after month, about what the community chest agencies were doing. And Mr. Dodge said, under those circumstances, we will keep you all year round. And I did not go back to Mr. Pizer.
I see. Could I ask you a question
Yeah.
about the Jewish Welfare, your contacts in the Jewish Welfare Federation? At the time that you were, although you were just there a short time, what issues do you recall, or what areas of concern did the Federation
Well,
have
the great
at that
areas
time?
of concern right then were to get our money in. We were not raising new money, as you heard me say yesterday. Neither we were getting people to pay their last year's pledges. And people were very hard up. Very hard up. The areas of concern in which the agencies were involved were the camp, the whatever we call the children's and family care. It's had several different names.
Was it Jewish Social Service Bureau?
Yes,
at that
first,
time?
yes.
Mhm.
The House of Shelter, the Hebrew Free Loan, and a very small subsidy to North End Clinic because, for research. And I think at that time we also paid some of the hospital bills of North End Clinic patients whose doctors were anxious to follow them to a hospital at which they practiced. Now, I'm not sure about that.
Who were among the leaders at Federation at that time?
Well, Fred, of course, dominated the whole picture. Always. All
Fred
over
Butzel.
Yes, all over the city. And Cy Schetzer was a terrific force. Cy Schetzer was the original thinker for the Jewish Community Council. And the Rubners, the Broders, what was Celia's brother, husband's name? Highbroder. Highbroder was a strong person. And the Weinemans, of course, were the largest givers. The Prentices were very large givers. Strange enough, Mr. Prentice worked for General Motors, which did not employ Jews. And who else? Dora Ehrlich, of course, among the women. Well, not only among the women. Dora Ehrlich was was always an outstanding person in her own right. And I suppose if I put my mind right on it, I think of a lot of other people.
Yes, but there were many.
I remember the Welts were active. Yes, Mrs. Welt, Belle Welt, had been president of the Jewish Social Service Bureau. And Mel Welt worked very hard for the Community Chest and also worked for us at Jewish Welfare Federation.
You said that Fred Butzel was the strong force.
Oh, and the Schreries. Oh, you mustn't forget Anna. Abe Shrery was a stalwart. And Anna was a lovely person who worked very hard. And Rose Cooper, the whole Cooper family, both Rose and Abe, worked for years. If we leave any of these people out, it's going to be deadly. And the Hops, Bernice Hop, and she hauled in her whole gang. The Ivercons, Mrs. Ivercon was much more interested in this, and that the females in that side always have been much more interested. Bernice Hop was a very strong person in the women's division. I don't know if she was strong before that. I really don't remember. Joe Weiner was one of them. And I'm sure if I looked at a list, I'd pick out a dozen more.
Yes, but there certainly are people who contribute a great deal to this community.
Oh, yes, and they're around now.
Yes, yes. Uh, Mrs. Krolik, I think that actually now perhaps we could go on to a discussion of your relationship with the Jewish Welfare Board.
Well, that was remote. I had been asked to be chairman of hostesses for the Jewish Welfare Board working in the USO. USO stood for United Community Services, and the different religions and the Red Cross were represented by quotas. It was the only time the quotas seemed legitimate. We were entitled to so many, or expected to produce so many hostesses in accordance with the numbers of Jews there were in the community. The YWCA contributed, the Protestant group, the Catholic Women's League or Service Group or something, contributed their share. And you were not identified beyond the fact that you produced your hostesses, after which you became a USO person. I became chairman of hostesses for USO for 2 nights a week. And then at that first year, the Jewish women did a very nice thing. And I think, to my knowledge, it's the first time anybody ever did this particular trick.
What year was this?
The first year I worked for USO, which must have been in the beginning of the war. After all, I had 3 sons in the war, and USO was very, very close to me. Gertrude Weineman was on the executive committee, I remember. And Gertrude Glogauer, I think, may have been on the executive committee. She was very active in the Jewish Welfare Board, and had been president of the center at one time. But Gertrude Weineman was very active locally at USO. I suggested to the women with whom I was working, the Jewish women, that Christmas Eve and Christmas night we take the duty, because it meant nothing to us, and it meant a great deal to our non-Jewish friends to be at home. And they welcomed it with great delight. And that tradition went on as long as USO existed. You brought the food, they brought beautiful food, turkeys and homemade cakes and all kinds of things. And they helped distribute Christmas presents, and they helped distribute Christmas trees. And it was a Christmas the way the servicemen wanted it, and the service volunteers were at home where they belonged, and we did the job. I noticed that other agencies have done a similar thing since. I have a feeling that was the first time that was done.
Was anything done particularly for the Jewish soldiers by
The Jewish Welfare Board always put on some kind of a deal for any of the Jewish holidays, to which anybody could come who wanted to. And I don't know if anybody else ever did come. I remember I was given the task of instructing hostesses in general at one time. And I told the Jewish girls that one of the things they had to watch out for was that they must not be too well dressed. They made it a point of being extremely well groomed and very, very on the mark. The other girls looked a little bit more like the girls next door and were a little more comfortable with the boys. Our hostesses were very, very good hostesses, and sometimes a little too good. Actually, I think if a boy was dancing with a girl or having coffee with her, he didn't much know who she was. Though you kept an eye on the whole crowd.
But you functioned at the USO headquarters, was
Yes,
that it? Uh-huh.
I was there 2 days a week. and as a USO volunteer. And
Was Faye Portner involved?
yeah,
at that
Faye
time?
Partner was director, and
Yes.
she was great. And then we had a Jewish woman who was in charge of the canteen, who was not quite so amiable. Oh, Faye Partner she had five people on her staff. Were you one of them?
No, she was a friend of mine.
Oh, well, she had a staff of 5 people, and everybody else was a volunteer, and she had hundreds of people pouring into that building, day in and day out. And we never had a scandal of any kind. One of the stories I love to tell about that, this is not appropriate, but it's such a good story. We got tickets free at 8:25 every night from the Schubert Theater when they saw they had anything left over. And at 8:25 you phoned them, the girl at the desk. And there was a lineup of boys standing in front of you. And they'd say, send over 6. Send over 8. And the first 8 in line went. And one night, after the first week or two, the Schubert called up. And they said, we'll have to ask you not to be quite so casual about whom you send. We really can't take the black boys, the Negro boys, you said in those days, in the downstairs seats. And the hostess in the line, who accepted the message, swallowed it and said, all right, I'll pass the word on. And then she looked at the line in front of her. And there were 3 Negro boys in it. And she said, I'm sorry, there aren't any seats tonight. And then she went and told Faye Portner what she had done. And Faye Portner said, you're perfectly right, and I will take it up with the Schubert. And it never happened again. That hostess, I just love. I don't know who she was.
Right. Now, we're going to skip a little in time, and I would like, if you don't mind, to talk a little about your relationship to the resettlement program in this community.
Well, the resettlement program was important to me because we were so overwhelmed by the horror of Hitler, and because I was very intimately bound up in it. Julian was bringing over a great many of his own family, and I could see.
What years did this?
30. We were married in 36, 37. Ernst Shire, the first one, came, and I think he ended up by having 21. That he brought, and everybody, you were very busy everybody was getting assurances and visas from somebody else. You had to have a guarantor before you could come. And one of the things you did almost immediately was set up an English learning program for the newly arrived immigrants. Many Germans had some English as a second language. A great many had none at all. These were all pretty much middle-class people, the ones I came in contact with, the ones that got shipped down to Detroit. You took people's families, and you took whom they sent from the central office.
That was United Service for New Americans.
Yes, trying to get as many out of New York City as possible. I asked my very good friend, Blanche Mendelson, Mrs. Samuel Mendelson, who was also the director of Temple Beth Sunday School, to take charge of the English-speaking program, to match the volunteer to the pupil.
Now, what group was this through?
This was under Resettlement Service. She was a committee under me.
I see.
And she did a perfectly beautiful job. If you had a certain kind of a man, sometimes you got him a man, maybe sometimes a lawyer, or something of the sort.
In other words, there were volunteers who
The
served
teachers
as
who we got
teachers.
were all volunteers. They were you asked the student to come to your home, and you perhaps worked with him on the things he wanted to know most. The simplest, you made no attempt to teach grammar. You got him to speak the phrases he needed to know. Where do I take a bus? How much is the rent? How much are these a pound? And these things you worked out as carefully as you could, and if he could spell, fine, and if he couldn't spell, equally fine. He had to be able to get around. Then with the vocational service, who were also working on the program, you hoped to get him a job, and Dave Wilkes was the housing committee, who was in the real estate business and worked very, very hard, and housing was tight during the war, very tight. You tried to get some place for them to live. Someone had to go shopping with them to buy what furniture they were allowed by our limited allowances. The main thing was that we were very conscious of the fact that these people had been driven out, had not come the way our own parents and grandparents had come to find a better world, but had been driven out under the cruelest kind of circumstances, and that they deserved a great deal of consideration and would repay it, which they did. My experience is that the German group that I knew paid back threefold. They began again in their turn to be helping. At the moment they got on their feet, they helped the next guy. Mr. Hertz, who's on the interior decorator, is on the board of the Resettlement Service and has been ever since. And there were others just like him. And that was great.
So that actually Resettlement Service played an important part between the staff of the agencies and the volunteer corps that worked so hard.
They couldn't, the staff of the agencies couldn't have faced it at all without the volunteers. Now, I'm sure volunteers always are a pain in the neck, but I think anyone on the staff of the Jewish Social Service Bureau would tell you that at that time the volunteers were really very valuable, very valuable.
What was your position with Resettlement Service, Mrs.
I was
Krolik?
chairman of the family service for a while, and then I was eventually chairman of the whole Resettlement Service thing. And until then, when it became evident that whatever staff there was could manage without the volunteers, when everything had quieted down, Resettlement Service discussed with itself whether it should go out of business. And we made what proved to be a very wise decision, that we should keep a sort of a skeleton agency going, so that if, as was the case with Hungary, we suddenly got an influx, and as the case now with the Russians, we'd be set and wouldn't have to begin all over again.
Also, Resettlement Service played a part with the indemnification
They did
filings,
all
too,
that.
did they not?
That they did entirely professionally. No volunteers touched that. And that's one of the things Ursula worked on.
Ursula Friedeberg.
Yes. But Ursula was invaluable. Ursula had been a nursery school teacher in Germany. And she came with her two brothers, and with her brother and father. And her father went to work immediately, doing an amazing job that I think my husband thought of. He sold specialized technical books that were not, he would not buy them, he would get the orders for them. Law books, art books, medical books. He built up a very good clientele. He could get all over the city himself. And he managed to maintain the household. Ursula was earning after a bit. Ursula always earned and got a much better salary when she really got a job. And Peter went to work at something quite uninteresting and developed. Volunteers were really very good on those jobs. And the staff, I think, would say so.
Great. Were you, was Resettlement,
nice
were you
story.
involved with the children also? That
We had nothing to do, I had nothing to do with bringing individual children, except the fact that we ourselves and our family had a child who was coming to us and who was lost. Magda, one of the small children of one of our families, and part of them are here now.
But Resettlement Service also had to do with the unaccompanied children.
They had a special program for the children, and I can tell you nothing about that. And they were bringing individual children. I think a lot of people who weren't interested at all in lots of things, Jewish and otherwise, were touched by the plight of the children.
Yes. Who were some of the people who were very instrumental in some of the lay people who were very instrumental in the resettlement program, Mrs. Krolik?
I should be able to tell you, and I'm not. There was one man who brought over, I haven't any idea how many people.
But I mean in relationship to the agency.
Well, I can't tell you.
Okay, that's all right.
Offhand,
Yeah.
I don't know.
You had mentioned Nathan Milstein as one of the people
Nathan
who...
Milstein was our attorney, and he was later became president of the Resettlement Service. After one or two, he was president for a long time. That's gone from me.
Okay. Now, let's go on a little to your involvement with the Women's Division. Well, actually, you started out in Federation as a volunteer with campaigns, but
Yes.
I would be very much interested in your telling us something about the development of the Women's Division.
I'm quite sure from what my younger friends tell me, that we decided, because I had a fairly big house on Chicago Boulevard, that the first fundraising meeting would be in my house. And we thought...
Was this for the division, for the organization?
For the Women's Division.
Yes.
We thought that we might have maybe 40 or 50 people. And I think maybe we were shooting at this time for big money, perhaps $100 a person. I'm not sure. You'd have to check with somebody who knows better than I. And Ann Daniels was one of my committee people, because I had worked with Ann a great deal in USO and was very fond of her. And she'd been president of council, I think. And the party, as people began, Mrs. Hyas, I think, was the speaker. The Hyases were refugees. He had been, I think, a native Israeli, and had been somewhere and had been driven out. And she was a Hungarian, or Viennese, I've forgotten which, and very emotional. Rose Cooper was very active in this thing, very active. Anyhow, about 10 or 12 minutes, maybe 15 minutes before the meeting began, there weren't enough chairs in the house. I had them all go down in the basement and find all the funny old laundry chairs. They were sitting on the radiator. They were sitting all up and down the stairs. And I grabbed Ann Daniels and told her to go out the back door and run up to Rainier's and get as many more cookies as she could find, which she did. It was a very successful meeting, apparently, because people like Ruthie Broder and some of the young Coopers, mostly Ruthie, and Lois Hop, tell me that was when they really got their first push. That Mrs. Hyos was very emotional, and the whole meeting went off very well. And
so this was the launching of the women's division.
I think, now I may be taking away someone else's glory. I can't swear to it, but I think that was, the girls have told me this.
Mm-hmm. What was conceived of as the purpose for the women's for the women's division?
Well, Dora said, with a great deal of common sense, yes, that women had the spending of a lot of money, that their husbands seldom questioned them, women in comfortable circumstances, as most of us were in those days. We were getting money for people who weren't. They were not questioned about what they needed, and they had the spending of money, and they were individuals in their own right, and this was a good source of extra money for the campaign, and it gave a woman a somewhat added dignity to give in her own right. There was a good deal of pro and conning. I like to give with my husband, and we share the same income and that kind of thing. But a good many of us felt that was valid. That if you, a lot of us had a little extra spending money of our own, a little that was our own or that you'd acquired or somehow. And I remember someone said, you walk your groceries home instead of taking the bus, and you save the car fare. And the answer was, I always save the car fare. There's nothing left over.
Was this a pattern that was taking place throughout the country?
I think we were one of the first ones.
Is that right?
And in many of the cities, it took place very much more mildly. Mm-hmm. I don't know any city, except maybe Cleveland, that has ever done anything nearly as dramatic and has raised such enormous sums. At the same time, I must say that I think perhaps the pattern for this had been set by the Women's Committee of the United Community Services, which had started before that, and which was to get the woman power, where they needed every volunteer they could get to dig up what money they could.
But the Jewish welfare
those women never gave separately. There was no attempt on the part to get separate women's gifts.
Oh,
it was a group of women solicitors.
I see.
And doers,
I see.
volunteers.
I see.
That group was a very active volunteer group in many, many ways. Then the Women's Committee decided, with a great deal of good sense, that you couldn't ask people to give money for something they didn't know what it was all about. And they began a very excellent, which has gone on ever since, educational program of half a dozen different kinds.
Who would you say were some of the founders and leaders who were instrumental in the development of the women's division?
Well, you've got Bernice Hop was terrific. Was really terrific. Dora was, of course, always the leading person. Joe Weiner was good. Clara Frank was very good. I shouldn't say this. You shouldn't let this go. You can just rattle off those names, because if there was anybody there whom I've left out, you've got to put them in.
Right.
But the fact is that I think the best one was what's her name, Lois's mother, Bernice Hop. She was great.
Yeah.
She never would take a job on the national board because she would not be away from her husband the amount of time that meant. And she's never had a real honor like all the rest of us have had.
Was the function of the women's division pretty much the same as it is today,
yes,
right from its onset?
A strong educational program and individual women's giving. I think, I sort of suspect, and I haven't been close enough to it for a long, long time, that much of the woman's giving now is blended, that a family trust gives a lot of money. I don't know how many individual women give anymore, but I think they have expanded enormously, and the phonograph The small gifts brings in many, many more than they used to. That was a very smart institution. Really very smart.
Yeah, that's a new development
I'll
in
never
recent
forget
years.
the first day we were all to meet at the fairgrounds. I think this must have been the first of the phonoglyphs. And dispersed to telephone somewhere, I guess. I may be mixing up two events. But as I drove up Woodward Avenue and saw this line of cars, it was really very exciting to think we really were all there and pulled it off.
Yes, I think that there was a period at the state fairgrounds
Yes.
where people came in to report.
Yes.
Yes, there was one day,
One day, a
Sunday.
report day,
Yes,
yes.
I believe so.
That was really quite exciting.
Yes. Are some of the children of the group who were active in the beginning active today?
Oh my gosh, the whole troop. I think almost every one of all the Joneses and the well, Lois, look at Lois. And Ruthie Broder. Ruthie Broder got it on both sides. And I don't know. You see,
So there's a real heritage
there's no
of
question about
commitment
that.
to the Jewish community on many of the leaders' children's
That
parties.
is true.
Yes.
There are very few Butzel people involved, because Fred was a bachelor, and the other Butzel children, Henry Butzel's daughter, is a professional social worker, has been, Simon, Ellie Simons. Simon's president of the Federation, right? No, just got over. He's president of UJ. I don't know. I guess he just got over that one too. He's president of something now, maybe of UCS. I think maybe that's what he. Anyhow, those families, the Fred Butzel and the Ehrlich family, I really can't tell you about. But twice we drew out of the community. 3 times, professionals, people who had been volunteers. B. Horowitz was the first one, who came in as a volunteer after her husband's death, and then became our director. Mm-hmm. Pauline Jackson, the same way. And now here's Lois Howe.
Yes, yes. Okay, now could we discuss an area that I know that you've been very much involved with for a long time, and that is the whole area of the health field, and particularly your relationship to Sinai Hospital. And
well, I'm not really interested in the health field. That isn't fair to say. I'm interested in the nursing field.
Right. Okay. Mrs. Krolik, let's talk for a little bit about your contact with Sinai Hospital. I believe your major contact has been with the Shapiro School of Nursing.
C.D. Broder suggested that because I had done a good deal of interviewing, both in various jobs that I had, both professionally and as a volunteer, that I might be helpful in interviewing the new students who were applying to the Shapiro School.
Could you tell me first why the school was organized? I think it was organized in 1956.
I was organized, I don't know, I can't give you the date. It was after my husband's death, and I was ready to do something, but not something that I could manage without being with large groups of people. And Celia asked me if I would like to do interviewing of students. I think Nate Shapiro had had a study made by a perfectly brilliant and delightful woman by the name of Mary Mullane, a Wayne graduate who had also been in charge of all nursing at Receiving Hospital, on nursing needs in Michigan. And one of the things that there seemed to be a shortage of was educational facilities for practical nurses. Practical nurses had just come into the world with the war. They had never been really legalized until they found they needed them when all the graduate nurses were away. And there was one small school in Detroit, run by the Board of Education, I think. And there were a few other schools throughout the state. The only one that I happen to know of that's connected with a hospital is the Shapiro School. And Nate Shapiro conceived the idea of having a very superior school with a very superior staff, well paid, and equipped to do experimental work of some kind. They naturally, in a highly desirable neighborhood and in a brand new building, were flooded with applicants. And we worked out a system of eliminating, let's go back a minute, I helped read all the original applications. And we worked out a system by which we graded them so that some were not even interviewed. They obviously didn't have the educational background, their schooling was not adequate, and so forth. And or they were too old or too young, something of that sort. And then they were called in for an interview. They were first given a vocational test, which was the same test that was administered at one of the big professional agencies. I remember we all had to go down and take the test before we were allowed to give the test. I flunked the test completely. I had never in my life seen a short answer question examination. I grew up in the days when you wrote a paragraph. And I knew that I was notoriously inaccurate, so I checked every answer twice. And I did not know we were being timed. So I didn't finish the test, and I flunked, just flatly flunked. And I later, very much later, I took one of the tests and upset the whole apple cart on that one. However, I learned to give the tests and did it to a degree, but it then became evident that we were very short of people to do the interviewing of the students. Any student